Blog Talk Radio.
Thank you tonight for listening in on Conservative is Cool Talk Radio. This is your host, Wayne Bradley. We've got a lot of issues to talk about tonight, and I've got a special guest. His name is Michael Johns. He is a Tea Party leader. He has so much experience, a lot of vast experience working at different levels throughout government and also in the private sector. And it's my pleasure to have him on the show. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Wayne. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much. I want to talk to you about a lot of different issues. If you could, for everybody that's listening, could you just give us a background of what you've done and exactly what with the Tea Party organizations and what you've done so far?
Well, the biggest thing over the last year, of course, has been the Tea Party movement, and I was fortunate enough to be engaged with that really pretty much from the beginning, which was about almost a year ago. When it really started to organize nationally. I'm chairman of the Patriot Caucus, which is one of several national Tea Party organizations. I'm also on the board of the Nationwide Tea Party Coalition, which is an excellent group of regional Tea Party leaders, and I'm also vice president of the Independence Hall Tea Party Association here in Philadelphia. And been involved in public policy, politics, healthcare, really my whole adult life. I was a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation, a speechwriter to President Bush 41, worked with the governor here in New Jersey, Republican governor, Republican senator for a while in the Senate, and I've been in the healthcare industry about 15 years, both in especially pharmaceuticals, home health, traditional pharmaceuticals, medical device, medical supply areas, all of which, of course, has led me to follow this legislation very, very closely, both from a policy standpoint and from a health provider standpoint.
Exactly. And with all your experiences so far with the Tea Party movement in general, do you see the future of it becoming a third party? Or do you see it becoming more or less something that's going to keep the conservatives in line, almost as a watch group to make sure that if we're electing, conservative candidates, that they're remaining conservative?
My best sense is that it's not likely to take the form of a third party. I think, while it's true that a lot of the Tea Party movement are, and count me in this group, frankly, are disappointed with both major political parties in the country. I think the perception is that it's probably an easier approach to fix one or both of these parties than it is to create a viable third party. So the focus that I see is on recruiting and supporting good candidates in hopefully both major parties. I know the focus has been largely in supporting Republican candidates, but I'm seeing that there are some people that are self-identifying as Tea Party Democrats. That's fantastic. If the reformation of the Democratic Party was one of the outcomes of the Tea Party movement, I think that would be fantastic. I would love to see the Democratic Party move back more toward its moderate tradition of JFK years and away from this radical agenda that it's been pursuing at great cost to our country. But I think the perception about a third party approach, Wayne, is that if you end up with a Republican candidate and a third party candidate, that is your tendency is to split the vote there, right. And it ends up being beneficial to usually the worst of the three candidates. That, of course, that's part of the concern with what's happening in Nevada right now. There's great dissatisfaction out there with Harry Reid. He certainly does not have the support of the majority of the people of that state. He barely has even a third of the state. But there is a Tea Party candidate running out there and several good Republican candidates running as well. And that's the danger, is that you end up kind of splitting that vote in a third party way. I think it's good to see people run with open affiliation with the Tea Party movement, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. And I think that we're seeing a lot. In fact, we're seeing most liberty-minded candidates of both political parties wanting to run with that level of support. Because I think everyone identifies that this is, and I certainly would, in my 25 years or so of doing this, I've never seen this level of political enthusiasm and anger and fear and passion. I mean, the American people very broadly feel this country and this Congress and this president have us on the wrong direction.
Now, realizing, like you said, the passion, some people being upset, some people being scared, that sort of thing. The media, most of the mainstream media, has tried to almost put a negative light on it. And I'm wondering, with you, like I said, you're one of the original founders of some of the national organizations. How do you feel about maybe some of the other more radical groups that are kind of, or maybe in certain situations, the media is taking something, one person, and making it like, smearing the whole Tea Party movement with that broad stroke?
Well, I mean, the approach that I've seen from mainstream media from the very beginning has been evolving. I mean, first they ignored the movement completely. I mean, even as literally tens of thousands of people were organizing in major cities around the country. That was sort of the approach they took last spring. Then into the summer, when I think it became clear during the August recess that the movement was actually growing even larger in influence, they began to sort of ridicule the Tea Party movement inaccurately. And I think lately they've taken the movement very seriously. I mean, there's no doubt that whether it's friendly or hostile analysis, that no one doubts that the Tea Party movement is influencing the political direction of the country. And I do think that absent their ability or I guess really more their unwillingness to really get into the substance of what I think are the very legitimate concerns of the national Tea Party movement, the inclination has been to try to put a label on it of any sort, and that has been to try to really stereotype the movement. Right. And I have to say, quite honestly, while there's always, there's a very limited barrier to entry into the Tea Party movement. It's not like, we're out there screening people necessarily before they're involved. I have to say, by and large, the impression that I've had of the movement, both on a national and local level, is that it's comprised of hugely patriotic Americans who have the best intentions and very legitimate concerns about the direction of the country, and have been remarkably I think, well-behaved and well-mannered in the approach that they've taken toward what have been some hugely controversial and dangerous policy paths. And there have been obviously some, periodic exceptions. There's been thousands of Tea Party events held over the last year, attracting, I think, by our estimate, over 5 million Americans. So if you look hard, you could probably find something where, we'd kind of wince a little bit. But, by and large, I have to say I'm pretty proud of the Tea Party movement. I think there's no major example of any, violence or derogatory language or even disrespect for these elected officials that, by and large, have opposed. It's been, I think the real story has been the exact opposite of how remarkably civil the Tea Party movement has been, despite very hostile and inaccurate media coverage of it, and I think a Congress and administration that has been, fairly unreceptive to its message over the last year.
Right. Why do you think that, how does it, just as someone with the experience you have, how is it the media can make an allegation like when they were going to vote and they showed all the congressmen walking in and the stories have been that they were, racial epithets were yelled at them, but yet and still it was videotapes everywhere. Jesse Jackson Jr. was actually carrying a flip camera, recording it the whole time while he's walking in. How come none of them have stepped up and said, yeah, I was called a name, and no media source has been able to produce that? How are they able to just put that message out there and no one calls them on it?
Well, how they're able to do it is sort of the challenge I think that we're facing. I mean, they shouldn't be able to do that. I mean, allegations of racism in my book are about as serious of an allegation as can be made against a fellow American. And the worst service we do to legitimate racism, which I don't think exists very prominently in the country any longer, but does exist in some corners, is to be labeling people that I know for a fact are not racist as racist. And I think, frankly, that what's at the root of all this, to answer your question, is the fact that because they don't really understand the policy positions of the Tea Party movement, or why the centralization of power and large, big taxation and big government and violations of our Constitution are so hurtful to the American people, they can't explain away the passion in any other way. Right. And the truth of the matter is that this movement is comprised of every type of American. I mean, as I mentioned, politically, it's very diverse. I myself, have been a Republican my whole adult life, but I supported the Tea Party movement's position in the New York 23rd race when the Republican Party put up a candidate up there that really did not support the views of the Tea Party movement. Right. I think ethnically it's very diverse. I'm sure it can always stand to be more diverse, and maybe that's a challenge for the second years to continue to reach out and to broaden the movement. It's certainly been well open to anyone who's cared to be a part of it. And that's been true ethnically and religiously. So you sort of look at that, and you do all these things right, and you have that label thrown upon the movement by critics. And I think it's just the quickest way to attempt to delegitimize what is a very, very legitimate set of concerns the American people have. I mean, if you're able to sort of dismiss it with that sort of throwaway line, right. Then it's you don't really have to get into the substance of the legitimacy of the points that I think are being made. And I found, just in my own conversation, because I've been doing this long enough that it doesn't become personal to me. I mean, if someone's politically educated and has reached completely different conclusions, I mean, I'm always interested in understanding those ideas and conversing, with them. And so I have lots of friends of mine and people I talk to that I would say are, they're self-identified liberals, and I've talked to them straight up about what their perceptions are of the Tea Party movement, and it's really amazing. I mean, they've never been to a Tea Party event, but because they sit, watch MSNBC all night, they hear that allegation thrown out half a dozen times in a night, and I guess it just sort of seeps into their brain.
I've been invited. I've been to a few Tea Party events myself, and again, that's a thing that they never seem to ask, because they never ask any of the, I saw tonight that they had on Bill O'Reilly. They had a Tea Party host that's been to a lot of different Tea Party events, and Kevin Jackson, matter of fact, and he said that I've never.
Yeah, I know Kevin.
Never had any incidents. But yet, for the most part, he will not get interviewed too often on MSNBC. And if they do, they'll only give him a quick minute to explain his side of it. Is that just strictly a bias that they have for Obama, or is it just that it's more of a thing with like you said, they don't know about the Tea Party?
Well, I think you're getting into some of the most sensitive areas of American politics. Is that the American liberal left has very little confidence in their policy agenda. And their ideas, by and large, which have been experimented with all over the world for the last century, don't have a very good track record of success. And in fact, they've been at the core of some of the worst failures of countries in the world. And they're obviously, if you look at the last year, anyone who thought that you were going to simply inject a lot of government spending into this economy and increase GDP overnight is learned the hard way that doesn't happen, as we've always warned that it doesn't. That's not the way you create national wealth.
Right.
So I think they've been unwilling to kind of get into a lot of the specificity of very legitimate concerns, and that they just have wanted to fall back on ways that they can get around discussing that level of detail. Kevin Jackson is a great leader in the Tea Party movement, a good friend of mine, and he and I have spent a lot of time talking about this, and he finds it a little more amusing than I do, but
right.
He
got a good good spirit about that, because
he's got a very good spirit about it, and he's funny about it too, because it's when you're inside this movement, it's just such an absurd allegation. These are really some of the most decent people I've ever encountered in my life. So committed to country and to their communities, and pretty selflessly committed. This
most of these people are not making money. You
right.
find out a lot of times that everyone is struggling to really keep stuff together, but they're willing to put their time and effort into their local Tea Party movements, and that is, like I said, that's what I see a lot more of. Is that, like I said, it's not an exclusive thing. Anybody's welcomed. If you want to come listen or talk or give your opinion, they usually let you do it.
Yeah, it really is comprised of American people that I think have very serious concerns that we're starting to abandon some of the principles many of the principles, frankly, that have been at the core of American greatness over the last, 2 centuries plus of our history, that we're forgetting our history and violating the Constitution and, basically moving down a road that much more resembles socialist Europe than it does the vision of our founding fathers.
Right. Looking at, you were really happy with the Scott Brown victory in Massachusetts.
I was, yeah.
At that time, how do you feel about it now? I guess that would be the question.
Yeah. Well, on the jobs bill, I think a lot of us had some concerns about the substance of that legislation, and of course he was a yes vote for that. But let me just say that I think the most encouraging part of his election is that Massachusetts, and especially Massachusetts after the death of Ted Kennedy, who held that seat for over 4 decades, was pretty much considered a safe bet to maintain its party affiliation with Democrats. And the fact that a Republican, and in fact a fairly conservative Republican, could run on the platform that he ran on and win Ted Kennedy's seat in Massachusetts tells me that there's no state, no area of this country that's off bounds for a liberty-loving conservative message. It can appeal anywhere and everywhere it's presented. And, so this whole idea that, it kind of came out of the Lee Atwater 80s that, Republicans need to focus on winning a few states and there are other states that are off limits. I don't subscribe to that, and I think that Massachusetts and Scott Brown's victory is a testament really to the fact that we can prevail in any state, in any district in this country. And in fact, it's our obligation to make sure that our ideas are presented in a competitive way everywhere in this country.
How much did you feel that the Tea Party movement, because it was obviously played a large part, and how much do you feel that played a part in Scott Brown's victory?
The biggest area was financially. With small donations, the Tea Party movement poured millions of dollars into that race in the final week, and I think that actually was very helpful. I think also I spoke up in Boston last April 15th, and I've mentioned before, I think you could just tell back then that something was happening in Massachusetts. There was concern about the direction of the country in a whole bunch of ways, and dissatisfaction with the administration and with this Congress. And it was across party lines, and it only built throughout the year. So I think really the Tea Party movement kind of laid some of the ideological and political ground for Scott Brown. I would have liked to have seen Scott Brown maybe more self-identify as a Tea Party candidate. But I think, they certainly laid the ground for that. There were a lot of volunteers in his campaign who were affiliated with the Tea Party movement. And I think the Tea Party national and Massachusetts-based Tea Party donations actually was a pretty considerable factor in the final couple weeks of that race and giving him a little bit of an edge there.
Okay, so, now, obviously, if other politicians and they see that kind of cycle and how effective that is, do you feel that in particular, I guess, like you said, with the GOP, are they trying to, I don't want to use the word take over, but are they trying to because all the leaders at the different events usually are Republicans, and so I guess that's the thing. Do you feel that they're trying to align themselves, or almost? I don't like to use the word take over, but just really align themselves directly with the Tea Party, so it's the lines are not blurred, and they're.
Yeah, I don't mind the phrase takeover. I mean, I think if the Tea Party movement became the GOP tomorrow, the GOP would be a better party than it is today. And I think that you would find in not all but most areas of the Republican Party a recognition that the Tea Party movement is helping, not harming, the party's cause, both by keeping it honest, holding it accountable, and developing and presenting good candidates. And I think certainly as Virginia and New Jersey and Massachusetts elections show, starting to tilt the balance back in our favor. So I think that there's a recognition by the party that the Tea Party's movements are doing some things that the party itself hasn't really done in a few decades.
Do you think that there is a possibility, considering that the bill's passed in March, that there's a lot of time between now and November, do you think that the Democrats, the president will be able to soothe some ruffled feathers, and because they've got to believe that they're going to still be able to get some of these votes in these different districts? Do you think that because of the Tea Party, do you think people are going to be able to forget about this? Will they be able to lull people to sleep over the course of the next 7 to 8 months?
I think the one thing I think they play politics very well, and I think even today to see Obama come out, on the drilling issue and say, right. I'm embracing drilling, and then 2 footnotes is I'm not going to do anything for 2 years. I'm only going to do it in this very limited area of the country, and I'm not offering any further specifics about it. In fact, what's he really doing? Nothing. I mean, if you embrace drilling, it's like, let's get going and let's do it now. He's right. Not doing that. He's throwing everything. I think everything to this president is political, and I just think that that's a product of his upbringing. He's really, his whole life has been that of a liberal activist, and right. He looks at everything from the perspective of political and social challenge and struggle, and that's also what makes him combative. This would be an ideal moment, if I were in his shoes, to reach out to the Tea Party movement. I mean, he mentioned this, I guess, the other day on the Today Show, where he said that he felt the Tea Party movement was being run by people that questioned his legitimacy. Well, I don't know if that's really on subject. I mean, on topic. The point is that you got a majority of the American people that view the Tea Party movements favorably or very favorably, according to Rasmussen polls, and a president who's, came in with sweeping, huge levels of personal popularity, who has collapsed significantly because his policies are viewed as antithetical to the American way and are really fundamentally disliked, distrusted by the American people, and most of all, they're not working. I mean, I think even though they were antithetical to the inclination of the American people, if they, I think if he had gotten a little bit of results from them, there would have been maybe a little more receptiveness toward it. But, I don't care whether it's the economy or the the social stability of the country or bipartisanship or how Washington works or America's standing in the world or national security issues. This country's worse off today in every single area than it was a year and a half ago.
Wow, yeah. Being a policy guy like yourself, do you know anyone, or have you read this 2,700-page bill?
I have to concede I haven't read the whole bill. I when the House bill went through, I did get through large parts of it, and then the Senate bill got through a lot of it as well, especially some of the more controversial parts of it. But the truth of the matter is, having worked in Congress, I'll tell you, members of Congress very rarely read legislation.
Right.
Well,
Nancy Pelosi said that we have to pass it before we can even read it. So
he said, seriously, I think she said we have to pass it to know what's in it.
Then we can
to even know what's in it. Yeah. So the absurdity of that, and the point is like some of these issues, as some of us have pointed out, are not unreasonable. Like for instance, let's take say the pre-existing condition clause for kids. That's one of the things that if you isolate that issue and ask the American people how they feel about it, they're pretty supportive of that particular component of it. But that part of it doesn't go into effect for 2 years. Right. Meaning everything that John Bonner and Mitch McConnell and the Republican leadership were saying about this legislation and the magnitude of it and the approach that was being taken, I think turned out to be exactly accurate, is that it would have been much better to have taken these issues on a case-by-case basis and addressed them. Yeah, address them with specificity, have sufficient amount of debate, allow amendments, have open committee processes. They didn't do that. They went behind closed doors, put together this 2,700-page bill, bought off votes with appropriations and earmarks, and and put together what is really a bill at the end of the day that has less to do with health care than it does the vast expansion of a centralized government, including tens of thousands of new IRS agents that are going to be enforcing the required purchase of health care, which I think almost certainly is unconstitutional.
And how did he get that financial aid package just thrown in there? That's just coming out. How was he able to throw that package into the health care bill, and how did that correlate with that?
Well, the political dimension of it was that because so much of this debate was done behind closed doors, and there was, you kept hearing over and over again, there is no bill, there is no bill, there is no bill, and finally there were 72 hours, to review it. The approach that this Democratic Congress wanted to, and its administration wanted to take, was to not afford the American people or even members of Congress the opportunity to give it the level of scrutiny that it deserved. And, they wanted to present the bill, and they wanted to get the votes, and as soon as they had the votes, they wanted to ram this thing through. And that's just, that was basically the race to the 216. As soon as Pelosi had the 216, it was brought up for vote, and I think you can safely say that, of 435 members of the House, maybe a handful actually really had the opportunity to read and understand the 2,700 pages. It just is, was unreasonable, unrealistic, and it was designed to be that way. That's what I think irritates the American people as much as the substance of the legislation, is the fact that the approach that was taken was one of almost acknowledging the unpopularity of this approach, throwing it all together in a way that was, confusing to everyone, not allowing there to be transparency or debate or dialogue or bipartisan amendment processes,
which was one of his biggest campaign,
and then forcing a vote.
Campaign promises was to do that.
Yeah, I think he's contradicted just about everything he said in his campaign. Not the least of which was the promise he had that he was going to cut taxes on 95% of the American people, and now, with energy proposals, with health care proposals, with consumer tax proposals, consumer product tax proposals, it's all about increasing taxes, and that's what a lot of us were saying. A lot of us were saying that back in 2008.
Very interesting. He was agnostic about raising taxes now on everybody. He was open to whatever.
Well, that's troubling because I think that that to me, when you're agnostic about taxes means you don't understand the huge role that taxes play in either the creation or the suffocation of economic growth and prosperity in this country. And the best thing we could do to get out of this recession would be deep, major tax cuts across the board right now to the American people, spark private sector capital, get jobs created, and get out of this mess. But you don't do that when you're moving in the opposite direction. And, I think for the most cynical Americans, it's almost perception that they want to deepen us into this crisis further. And, that getting out of it is really not what it's all about for them. They're about centralizing power, growing our federal government, increasing the role of the federal government in the lives of the American people, rendering our Constitution essentially irrelevant for the purposes of legislation. And, really, that's the fundamental change that I think we're all realizing that he was talking about when he used that phrase in the campaign. But a lot of us, saw through that and did our best to kind of warn the American people that this had all the code language. It said all the code language of the far left. As you probably well know, he was the most liberal member of the U.S. Senate, bar none, out there. The idea that he was a post-partisan, figure who was going to appeal to bipartisan aspirations was absurd from the beginning. He is he's a very far left ideologue, and he surrounded himself by people that are even more far left, and even more radical than he is in this administration. It's, to me, and to I think anyone who's followed it closely, a very threatening administration in that sense.
Do you think, from a political standpoint, with the GOP, the way they've been able to advertise is that they're the party of no right now? Do you think, from where they're standing, do you think they should get more actively involved about at least promoting what their ideas were, to kind of kill the notion that they're just not being cooperative at all with the president? Or do you think it's smart politics? And also, honestly, they just don't feel like they're getting anything done trying to communicate with them anyway.
Well, yeah, in defense of Republican leadership in the House and Senate, first, when you're not invited into the room and all of these negotiations and crafting of legislation are done behind closed doors just with Democrats, you're not part of the process. And when you spend all of an effort writing up, legislation and, a House committee can table it with the slam of a gavel on a strict party line vote, you can kind of understand how that doesn't become the primary focus of a minority party. So I think there's nothing wrong with the Republican Party saying no, and even being the party of no, because there's only two answers, yes and no, right? So, you either are supporting this bad legislation or you're doing what you can to stop it. And, with the numbers they have in the House and Senate, as I think John Bonner and Mitch McConnell have acknowledged, their role really becomes one of trying to stop bad things from happening. Right. And it is a tribute to the leadership and to the Tea Party movement as well that let me word it this way, the only thing bipartisan really about this legislation was the opposition to it, right?
Exactly.
You had, not one Republican who supported it. They could not throw one Republican vote. And there I think there were a lot of Republicans who were probably predisposed to wanting to be supportive of it, and they ostracized them. They didn't work with them. They didn't seek their support. They didn't want a bipartisan piece of legislation. They rejected every piece of guidance and suggestion that was really offered by Republicans, and I just think that they got what they wanted, which was a very ideological bill, and in the process, in exchange for that substantive legislative victory, they've alienated, the vast majority of the American people in a way that I think is going to cost them significantly in November.
And we're going to talk a little bit about November. I got a question from somebody on Twitter. They want to know how you feel about rhinos like Palin and knee-jerk Republicans like Sean Hannity hijacking the Tea Party movement. That was a direct question.
Okay. Well, the first thing I've come to learn about the Tea Party movement is that they're very conscious about not being hijacked. So I don't think anyone's hijacked the Tea Party movement. I think, if anything, there's a lot of skepticism within the Tea Party movement toward Washington, D.C. generally, even people on our side in Washington, D.C., and toward organizations in Washington, D.C. So I don't think the Tea Party movement has been hijacked. I think they're probably, just because of the magnitude of the movement, you would probably find some issues, maybe most prominently in some of the foreign policy areas. If you drilled down, maybe even in some of the social issues, I don't know, where you might be able to find some differences. But for the most part, it's been a very homogenous movement. I mean, it's really been very unified, I think, in its message, which is centered around fiscal responsibility and legislative constraint, respect for our Constitution, tax relief, and limited government. I mean, those are principles that the vast majority of the American people support, and they've been at the forefront of the message of the Tea Party movement for a year now. And I really think with each passing week over this year, the Tea Party movement has grown more and more powerful. It's probably, not an overstatement to say that this is the most dynamic and fast-growing political movement in American political history. And I know that's a very bold statement, but I think I don't think there's anything that really rivals it. Certainly nothing in the liberty side, in the liberty movement, or in the conservative movement, in the history of the country that rivals it.
What's your take on Sarah Palin's involvement in it? She's kind of become like one of the leaders, obviously from a notice, who she is. She's become one of the leaders. She spoke out in Arizona. What's your take on her, and do you think that she's going to be a candidate in 2012?
I think she's one of many high-profile political figures who's very well thought of within the Tea Party movement. There's a lot of fondness for Sarah Palin, and I think her appeal is both the substance of her policies and maybe even a little bit of her just common sense demeanor that appeals to the American people and to the Tea Party movement. So I think any 2012 presidential candidate who is able to have the Tea Party movement behind them has got a leg up toward the nomination. And I would say from being as involved as I am and what I've been able to see in our strategy is not that we're out trying to recruit a candidate to be the Tea Party candidate. I think we're trying to build this movement in a way where all candidates will see advantage from having Tea Party support, will want to come to us and cultivate our support, and then hopefully we're in a position to ultimately get behind the candidate that best reflects the core principles of the Tea Party movement, whether that's Sarah Palin or someone else. And as far as her aspirations go, I kind of give her the benefit of the doubt that when she says she hasn't made a decision on that's probably true. I think she probably has not made a decision. And I think that, if she is going, having worked at that level, I'll tell you that I think there's a lot of things that you need to be prepared for and need to do before entering that realm. And she still probably, I think even she would concede, has some things that she would need to do to prepare, for that level of political candidacy. But I think when asked, what national figures does the Tea Party movement look to, I'm not sure we really do look to any figures, but when pinpoint on that, I'd say, Sarah Palin's very highly thought of in the political world, and I think in the media world there's a lot of positive views for the things Glenn Beck has been saying and doing, and And I kind of, I have a very favorable view toward both of those people.
Right, okay. Let's see here. Other question for you about, so you being in the healthcare field, and then we'll go back, kind of just get back to the bill just quickly. You being in the healthcare field, how does this affect, with the bill the way it's written currently, how does this have a positive or negative effect on the healthcare industry and obviously within the private sector? What does that do? How does that affect it?
I think it's I think it's going to be pretty uniformly negative. I mean, for starters, there are new taxes that are being placed on various segments of the healthcare industry, medical device industry, et cetera. Those taxes are going to come at the expense of innovation that is used for the treatment and cure of disease. So I think that's dangerous. Number two is that while all these regulations on private insurance on the surface may seem sensible, ultimately what I think the ultimate outcome of it all is going to be is that you're going to see the cost of premiums increasing both for employers and employees, and that private health insurance will, I think, pretty rapidly cease being a common benefit offered by employers. And I think that actually is the end game that they are searching for. I think that starts to create. I think once you start to have, especially small and mid-sized employers unable to afford to offer health insurance, and you start to create a market mechanism where it becomes unaffordable to do that, and then you start to really increase the demand for the public option or a single-payer system, and that I think is the direction that they want to go. So I think there it's going to be dangerous as well. The problem in dealing with Medicare from a health provider or clinician standpoint, in dealing with Medicare, Medicaid, or VA system, whatever it is ultimately they set the rules from their perspective, never from a patient's perspective or a provider's perspective. Right. The rules are always evolving. I mean, that's been the one common denominator of my career in healthcare, is that there's been no stability at all in the regulations or reimbursement methodologies or anything as it relates to particularly Medicare. And, because of the fiduciary pressures, the primary focus of those in CMS who manage Medicare and Medicaid is routinely not on the quality of care or access to care, but on how you cut costs. And so when we talk about, in the most extreme sense, death panels, or the more, in a conventional way, just healthcare rationing, when you put that much power in the hands of any payer of health services, whether it's a private entity or a public entity, but especially if it's a public entity, you don't allow the level of competition or market pressures to take place that are constructive for the ultimate beneficiary of those policies. In this case, it's obviously the patient. So there's nothing important. Like, one of the important discussions for this country to have, which we're not having, is how can we provide better health care? We already have the best health care in the world. How do we have the best health care that continues to get better, that becomes more innovative, that becomes maybe better in a disease prevention standpoint and in a disease management standpoint? How do we develop better surgical techniques? How do we better manage chronic disease? How do we cure disease? What do we do about the big killers of cancer and heart disease? Nothing in this legislation is going to encourage progress in those areas, and many things in this legislation are going to, at the end of the day, leave those committed to discovery and treatment of those conditions with less resources to do it than they were before the legislation was put in place. So from a provider standpoint, I realize Obama had a few, that Rose Garden event with a bunch of guys where they handed out white coats. Can you remember that? So they, we were all laughing like, who would show up for a White House meeting in your surgical, uniform. But so I know they tried to put forward this image that somehow clinicians and healthcare industry generally were behind the legislation The reality is they bought off some segments of big industry, but I think that if you polled your typical doctor, your typical nurse, your typical, owner of a medical device or medical supply company, that you would find that there's abundant and deep levels of concern about this. And in fact, the polling that's out there that suggests the magnitude of physicians that are prepared to leave the practice as this is implemented is frightening, because we're actually entering a point in this country's evolution where we need more clinicians, not less. And I think the danger of this legislation is it's not really providing much incentive to stay in the profession. And if you've noticed, over the last 2 decades, back in the sort of 60s, 70s, becoming a physician was considered, the most premier profession that was out there and that was available. It attracted the best and the brightest. With each passing year, that's become less true. And in fact, more and more new physicians entering practice in the United States are foreigners who are drawn from other countries because there's a slightly better level of compensation here than there might be in their home countries. But you're not seeing the best and brightest drawn into healthcare because it's become a very bureaucratic, government-directed, and in many cases not particularly lucrative profession. In fact, even managed care, which no one likes, right? That's kind of the way they the limited support that they did galvanize around this. They galvanized because they were able to, build on the widespread concerns about private insurance. Their profit margins are 2.5%. They're actually closer to the bottom of profitable industries than they are to the top. And I guess you kind of ask these questions never get asked, but to a Nancy Pelosi, to a Harry Reid, to a Barack Obama, let's assume they're making they're clearing a margin of 2.25% or so on average. Is that too high? Should it be 1%? Should it be 0%? Should they lose money every year, in the process of fulfilling government's aspirations and expectations?
Well, it seems like that's what the government wants to slow it down.
Yeah, those become
not be motivated. Everybody do the exact same thing. That breeds the lack of motivation and the innovation that's made America the country it is.
Right, and the implications of these policies, I don't really think get the level of deliberation that they need. Because I think we've all learned, capital in this world can flow from country to country in a second. It can flow from industry sector to industry sector in a second. And when you do to the American healthcare industry what this president and this Congress have just done, it becomes less appealing, not more appealing, to be in healthcare, and it becomes less appealing, not more appealing, to be doing healthcare in the United States. And I've already seen speculation that, private insurance companies, the next step they might be taking for cost containment purposes is developing out-of-country surgical sites.
Yeah, I was about to say, they already do that. They send people over to India. People do it already, where they're going to India and places like that for cheaper surgeries. Yep,
and they're outsourcing radiology pretty routinely. And I guess all of this gets to a really fundamental question that, it was never really brought up as part of this debate because I guess maybe it's uncomfortable to both sides. But is healthcare, our health products, our health services, private or public commodities? I think we in this country have had an inclination to want the best of both worlds. We've wanted to have the innovation and competition and choice that you would commonly associate with a private sector industry, and yet we wanted the safety and access and reliability and control that you would associate with, a public sector service or commodity. So is this the post office or is it, Federal Express?
There you go.
I think the the inability of the country to really address that fundamental question leaves you with this amalgamation of just bad policies. It's really just a Band-Aid on a broken system. And that's why I had hoped all along that the process that would have been taken would have been a more deliberative one to say, hey, look, let's take the worst components, because there's things in American healthcare that are the envy of the world, right? I mean, one of them is our innovation. I mean, this is the place that God forbid you have a life-threatening illness, you're in the right country. This is where you want to be. And then there are things that are just outrageously unacceptable in our healthcare system, and a lot of it is just a product that the system hasn't kept up with the pace of social change in the country.
I got a question from one of our mutual friend, Chris, who linked us up for this interview. He sent me a couple questions for you here, and I wanted to make sure I got them in because he's the one that actually made sure we got this interview together. He wanted to know about the Democrats that didn't vote for the health care bill and how do they sit with the Tea Party. That was one of his questions.
Right. It's a good question. My response to that, and in fact, I just did an interview with Politico a few weeks ago where I said I think that Democrats who stood their ground in opposition to Obamacare can expect some level of political support from the Tea Party movement. I think that's correct. Now, obviously, there's more issues than just health care.
Right.
And if you've got a candidate who came down on the right side of this but was on the wrong side of, tax policy and government spending and constitutional adherence and limited government, it might be unreasonable to think that you're going to get a whole lot of Tea Party support. But certainly, as I said, this really is a nonpartisan movement, and I think there's a great degree of appreciation in the Tea Party movement for all Democrats who stood their ground, because we all know very well, I mean, those of us who've been in politics and even those who got to Washington this past year through the Tea Party movement, that the magnitude of political pressure that was brought down on those guys was serious and significant, and it takes a really strong backbone and some pretty thick skin to be able to stand your ground and vote no. So I think there's a lot of respect in the Tea Party movement for those members of Congress who did hold their ground.
And another question he had is, where are they with the GOP? Are they pretty confident with Republicans? And like you said, it's a kind of a nonpartisan issue, but he wants to know, is the GOP confident with the Republican Party? And his last question is, what do we do next? What's next? What do we need to do?
Great. Well, answer to the first question on the GOP, which I'm stealing from someone. I can't even recall who answered it this way, but I thought it was very correct, was that the Tea Party movement sort of has the Republican Party on probation. The jury's sort of out. I mean, we see some good things happening in the party, and then we see some concerning things. The party itself has become, I think, and I'm talking about the RNC now, I think a less principled body than it once was. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I don't think that it's, one of which is that you've had all these other conservative institutions that have emerged in the country, and so funding has flown into them at the expense of the RNC, leaving maybe moderate Republicans at a disproportionate percentage of their donor base. But I think, largely the inclination of the Tea Party movement is an open door with the GOP, and just try to. I know I'm communicating at very high levels with the Republican Party, pretty routinely on broad ranges of both big picture issues and minutia. So it's a collaborative, decent relationship that I think it's always got to be worked on. It could always be better, and it definitely can be better. As far as where we go next, I mean, if you look at what the success of the Tea Party movement has been over the last year, the biggest undeniable success that even the opponents of the movement would acknowledge is that we've brought millions of people into the political process for the first time in their lives. For the most part, what have they done? They've shown up at rallies. Maybe they've made some political donations. They've spoken out a bit. They've written letters to the editor of their newspaper. I mean, they've taken sort of the first baby steps of political engagement. And I think Tea Party 2.0 is going to be the evolution of the Tea Party movement into a 2010 political force. And that's a very big step, a very big transition to be able to move from essentially a movement of no, as you referred to earlier, to a movement that actually now is going to get out and influence the direction of political races in this country on a state, on a congressional level, and on a senatorial level, and all the way down to municipal and school board levels. And that is, the direction that the movement's taking right now is it's becoming engaged in politics at the national, state, and local levels, and trying to affect positive change by identifying, recruiting, and supporting good candidates that support the overall message and vision of the Tea Party movement.
Right. And I was when I was at CPAC, I noticed that Ron Paul won the straw poll, and I just had another comment from somebody here saying that Ron Paul is the Tea Party's national figure. Is he actively going around, or is he just because of his independent stands on a lot of things? Is that, you figure that's the main reason he's considered a national figure amongst the Tea Party?
I think that the activists in Campaign for Liberty and in what I would call the Ron Paul movement, they're very passionate people, and they're very knowledgeable people for the most part. They certainly propelled his candidacy, and it was a very well orchestrated grassroots campaign. I think, and Ron Paul. We haven't seen a lot of Ron Paul over the last year, but I think and we don't know. We're not maybe in agreement on everything. I think there's some unanswered questions as it relates sometimes to that agenda, but that's okay. I think the point is that the Ron Paul movement, like the libertarian movement, is very welcome and at home within the Tea Party movement. And I don't think the Tea Party movement's going to do anything to alienate those movements. The inclination is to try to make it as homogenous and collaborative as possible, because they are part of what we're trying to do.
All right, we got 2 minutes left here. I wanted you to, can you give any suggestions for people that are listening that might want to start their own Tea Party organization in their local area, or any tips that they might need to get started with their organization?
I think the first thing is to even before you start maybe your own organization, is to look out as to what exists in your respective communities. We spent a lot of time and effort over the last year creating, I think, what have got to be now thousands of Tea Party organizations. And, there are varying sizes and sometimes of varying effectiveness. But, you certainly should reach out and see what's available in your respective area. And if there isn't one, then you should, get, your friends and family together to support these agendas and bring one together. And I think, what you're going to see over this coming year is what you've seen over the last year, which is that there's a lot of national and regional levels of support for those who are entering the movement for the first time.
And for everyone listening, can you also give them your blog location so they can go check you out online?
Sure. It's Michael Johns on Freedom and Prosperity.blogspot.com.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show. I hope to have you on again as a guest. Like I said, I did a lot of research about you, and you have a very interesting story. Next time, I'd like to talk a little more about the GOP's fascination with Ronald Reagan, and what as far as the candidates we're picking. But I definitely appreciate you coming on the show tonight.
Thanks. Well, we're all operating in Reagan's shadow, I would say that. Thanks a lot, Wayne. It's great pleasure talking to you, and thanks for all you're doing. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, I'm gonna shoot you an email, because I would like to talk to you a little bit more in depth and get some more information from you. But it's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you very much. Take care now.
All right. Have a good evening. God bless you. All right. That was Michael Johns calling in for the show tonight. Hope everyone enjoyed the interview. If you want to go online after this interview, we can go on the blog a little bit and talk a little bit more about it. We can also talk a little bit more about it on Twitter. But again, thank you, Michael Johns, for coming on the show. Let me know what you thought of the interview, everybody. Shoot me a tweet, or like I said, we're on the blog. If you get a chance, visit the website, conservativeiscool.com. All previous recordings are on there, and we have a lot of activities, things on there for you to interact with. So thank you again for listening to Conservatives Cool Talk Radio. This is your host, Wayne Bradley, saying good night and God bless.